Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope you're well and having a great week. And if you're wondering, like me, why spring hasn't fully sprung yet, this might just be the video for you. I don't think it's news to anybody who follows my channel that I love books about cold places. I've mentioned this before, particularly mountains and Antarctica. I seem to be drawn to these desolate locations where we're not designed to survive. I'm fascinated what drives people to climb Everest, why people go to Antarctica, why they live in places that are so cold and remote. So in this video, I'm going to introduce you to 6 books that are all based in cold places, and they're a real wide variety of genres as well. So hopefully by the end of it you'll find that there's something you might want to pick up, but make sure you grab a blanket at the same time. So first of all, I wanted to talk about Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. It's quite a well-known book that was published in 1997. It's an exploration of the Everest disaster of 1996, where 12 people lost their lives. Jon Krakauer was actually a member of the expedition who tried to, succeeded in climbing Everest that year, when a storm came in and many of the climbers got left behind for many different reasons. They got caught up in the storm and perished. One of the reasons I really like this book is Jon Krakauer, he knows how to write, and having been there himself and been part of this expedition, it brings something really new to the exploration. He's by no means not the only person who wrote about these events, and you may be familiar, you know, they made a film of his book as well, Everest, which came out a few years ago with Jake Gyllenhaal in it. So you may know the story from that particular film. But as I say, you know, his was probably the first book that was published and very closely after the event took place. And what I really love about his depiction is how he really brings the sense of Everest to life, the hostile conditions, the sensory elements. He really knows how to write. You might also know his book Into the Wild, which was published before Into Thin Air. So basically the book, though, Into Thin Air, it talks about how he was employed as a journalist in a way to kind of promote these expeditions that were taking place in the end of the last century up to Everest, which were allowing more and more people access to the highest mountain in the world. And what I find fascinating is, as I say, what motivates these different people, the different members of the team that were climbing that year under Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, which were the 2 expeditions that this focuses on. It's quite interesting to bear in mind that there was quite a lot of controversy when this book particularly came out, because certain depictions and observations that Krakauer makes about the events put members of the team in perhaps not the most positive light. So I've actually read 4 or 5 different accounts of these events from different survivors. One of the other events that books that I really recommend is Left for Dead by Beck Weathers. He was one of the mountaineers who was left on the side. He was left there because they thought he was as good as dead, but then so many hours later after the storm, he just wandered into camp. And this book isn't just about the tragedy and the loss of life that took place that year on Everest. It's also about how he turned his life around as a result of nearly dying in this storm on Everest, and his relationship with his family, his relationship with his wife. So I really enjoy that, the Beck Weathers Left for Dead. But there were also books by Anatoly Bukhnev, who was one of the climbers that didn't really come off in the best light, Jon Krakauer's depiction. He sadly has since died himself in a mountaineering incident not many years after actually this took place. There's also depictions by Lemmy Gamelgard, who was another survivor of the events on Everest that year. But he's just Jon Krakauer has a really accessible style, but he really brings the location to life. And being able to read about these events through the eyes of somebody who was actually there, and that's someone who can really write, is fascinating and gripping. It's such a tragic event, the way these people lost their lives really needlessly, but through that sense of adventure and that drive that takes people up the tallest mountains in the world. So that is definitely my recommendation if you're new to books about mountains, if you're new to books about cold places and really want to get stuck into something that's a non-fiction that feels like a thriller at the same time. Into Thin Air would be my my first recommendation. Secondly, I wanted to introduce you to this particular book by John McGregor, Lean, Fall and Stand. I've been a big fan of John McGregor ever since his first book, If No One Speaks of Remarkable Things. He's got a really unique, almost in sometimes sort of a fragmented or stream of consciousness kind of way of writing. He's quite experimental, but there's something about his books that, you know, I feel in safe hands, but they're definitely have his own specific and individual voice. So you may also know Reservoir 13, which was shortlisted for the Booker a few years ago as well, which I also really enjoyed, but it's sort of a Marmite style, I think, in the way of writing. But this particular book is about an exploration in Antarctica, a modern day exploration. There are 3 Englishmen who are part of a GPS mapping expedition, and they get caught in a storm. So we have Robert, or Doc, who gets suspended above a sheer drop in this storm. Then we have Thomas, who's stranded on an ice floe, and Luke, who's caught sort of sheltering by the automobile. And the book's separated into 3 sections. Lean is all about the events that actually happen, and for me, that was the part that gripped me. That was the bit that I really enjoyed, and I kind of wish the whole book was about their experiences in Antarctica. But actually it isn't. It's about language, and it's about loss of language. And basically one of the characters who's caught in this storm has a stroke during the event, and he loses a lot of language. He loses his power of speech. And so the other sections of the book are about his recovery and about his relationship with his wife. So it begins with this freezing cold, thrilling, high octane life or death situation in Antarctica, where you really feel the cold, you really feel the storm, and then it moves on to something else completely, in a way, this exploration of language and what happens when we lose the ability to communicate and to process the events that we've been through. So I think it's a really interesting novel, and as I say, John McGregor's got his own particular writing style, and if you've read any work by him again before, then I would recommend this one. If you've not read anything by him before, I'd probably recommend Reservoir 13. Probably my favourite one of his books that I've read. But if you like cold places, this is an interesting exploration of language and of landscape that I would definitely recommend. And that was published in 2021, so it's also sort of quite a contemporary work as well. The next book I wanted to mention, not to be confused with Into Thin Air, is Thin Air by Michelle Paver. So I've spoken about Michelle Paver before. She wrote a book before this one, which was called Dark Matter. And what's really odd in a way, I love both of the books, but they are so similar. They're both based in cold places. I think the first book is like an Antarctica type location. This one is about climbing in the Himalayas. So it's climbing up a mountain. I'm just going to check my notes here so I pronounce it right. Kangchenjunga in the Himalayas, and it's based in 1935. And so 5 Englishmen go off to climb this mountain in the early part of the last century, and it's about their relationship, how they work together, how paranoia starts to come into the climb. But it's also a ghost story, and it's a really effective one. I really like both this, as I say, and Dark Matter. But what's strange is, although the locations are different, they're very similar books in terms of the themes. They're both ghost stories. They're both kind of about the ghosts of the past following these explorers. So in this particular book, it starts off, they're following in the steps of a failed expedition that's taken place recently before they get there, and they spot a rucksack that seems to follow them on their journeys, and it's sort of this symbol of this these deaths of what happens to these previous climbers. But if you love a ghost story, if you love something that's going to send chills both around the location but also the subject matter, this is a really good one. I really enjoyed this. I do love a ghost story, and I love a book about mountains and cold places. So this is a really thrilling and atmospheric, as it says on the front, book. This was published in 2016, as I say, so after Dark Matter, but it's really uncanny, and yeah, and as I say, also really interesting exploration about what drives these 5 Englishmen to try and climb one of the most technically difficult climbs in the Himalayas, but also their relationships and how that kind of breaks down over time during this test of endurance. So yeah, really enjoy that one. As I say, if you've read Dark Matter though, you will find it is quite similar in tone and subject matter to that particular book. Next, I wanted to pick something that was a little bit more contemporary. This is All the White Spaces by Ali Wilkes. This was published in 2022. This is another Antarctic exploration. Basically, it follows on from World War I. Our main protagonist, who travels under the name of Jonathan, has lost their brother in World War I, and it was always their brother's ambition to be an explorer, really, and travel the world. And our protagonist here is a transgender character, so is known as Jonathan, but is travelling, having to conceal their identity as well. Again, this is, as I say, based in the early part of the latter century, and they find themselves in a position to be able to live out these adventures in a way where they are sorry, words escape me, respected for their skills and their abilities, despite their gender. So the character stows away at the beginning and goes to Antarctica with a world famous explorer called James Randall. And again, disaster strikes. Things never run smoothly, and they find when they get to Antarctica they have to take to the land and try and traverse to find somewhere to shelter, whilst all around them everything's freezing up and they're going into the Arctic winter. So again, you know, the cracks start to form between the characters under this immense pressure and in this cold and freezing location. So it's an interesting book. It's about survival. It's really gripping, but it feels really fresh and contemporary as well. And there's something terrible waiting for them out there, and it's all about what happens when they reach the location and disaster strikes, as I say. So again, really gripping, life or death. But so much more than that as well. It's sort of adventurous, but again, you know, as I say, I'm fascinated by how the relationships between people come under pressure, and how and why people undertake these kind of adventures in the first place. So this is a fictional, like Michelle Paver and John McGregor. These are fictional books. Next, I wanted to talk about another book that I'd read quite a long time ago. It was published in 2008, but one that stuck in my mind that I had to go and root it out. And quite differently, it's got a bright red warm cover, you know, in comparison to all the cold and blue and chilly covers that we've been looking at so far. So this is a completely different book, really. This is a coming of age story in World War II that is around the siege of Leningrad in 1942. It's by David Benioff, and it's called City of Thieves. So it might be a book you've already heard of. As I say, it's been out for some time. It came out in 2008. But it's about two prisoners, two Russian prisoners. One is Lev, who was arrested for looting, and then he's alongside Kolya, who is a deserter, and they're given a reprieve. They're given so long to go and find a dozen eggs for the colonel's daughter's wedding cake, and there's a a possibility of freedom through them if they manage to find these eggs. So they go off on this journey together. It's actually starts off, it's Lev's grandson, sorry, who wants to write about these experiences. So we start off with David, the narrator in the modern day, who starts off with this fascination of the events that his grandfather sort of was reluctant to talk about, and then we go back into the narration for the actual events during the Second World War. So it's really gripping. It's kind of a bromance in some ways. It's full of really chilling and disturbing details and insights into what life was like for people at that time. But there's also humour there, there's also action, it's funny, it's tragic, it's fast-paced, and it's about this friendship between these two prisoners as they fight to survive in this incredibly harshly cold environment during this siege, where people are starving basically on a daily basis. And I found this fabulous quotation in the book as well, which sort of gives you a bit of an insight into their mental state as they're trying to survive on this fool's errand to find these eggs in a city where people are starving. It says, contrary to popular belief, the experience of terror does not make you braver. Perhaps, though, it is easier to hide your fear when you're afraid all the time. And I think this kind of links into all of the books that we're talking about in this particular video. But if you're interested in books about wartime, if you're interested in survival against the odds, this is a really entertaining, thrilling and enjoyable ride. But as I say, it deals with some powerful topics, but there's also humour there, and again this sort of charming relationship between these two young men who are surviving against the odds. And last of all, I wanted to mention a book that won the International Booker Prize, I think, a few years ago. It was originally published in 2009, and then it was translated by Antonia Lloyd-Jones in 2018, and that's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokaczuk. And this was the book, when I saw the title, I had to read straight away. And I love these beautiful blue covered books from this particular publisher. You'll have seen quite a few of these. They do quite a lot of translations, and they're immediately recognisable. And another reason why this is a particular book that's interesting to talk about at the moment is that it's just been made into a play. So you can actually go and see a play version of this. But it's actually based in a remote Polish village. So again, a completely different location, but they're snowed in, it's freezing cold. And again, you get those real chills with the reading. It's actually a murder mystery, but what I really loved about this book is the central character, who's so unexpected and sort of prickly, but really entertaining. Her name's Janina, and she's an ageing lady. She lives in this rural village where she works sort of looking after houses when people aren't in them, when it's out of season. But she also translates William Blake's poetry, and she studies astrology. And so there's all these aspects, unexpected aspects to her personality, which are really, really intriguing. And she's really into animal rights as well. And the whole book sort of kicks off when her neighbour, whose nickname is Bigfoot, is found dead in his house, and he's a big hunter. And she starts off with this theory, but perhaps the animals that are being hunted and targeted are kind of having their revenge on the community around them, who aren't treating them as well as they can. And there's actually about 5 deaths in the end that take place in this village, and so it becomes a murder mystery, and it's sort of this uncanny suggestion as to whether or not these deaths are by chance, whether they're murder, whether they're homicide, or whether there's this slightly uncanny relationship with nature, and that nature's taking back and having revenge for the way that these animals are being treated in the location. So there's so much to pick apart here. You've got a really fascinating character, you've got a cold, really chilly location, which I love, but you've also got this fascinating murder mystery as well. But the personality, Janina's character, really carried it for me. I'm not really interested in astrology, I'll be honest, and Blake's poetry has always confused me. But I really, really love this book. I really enjoyed it, and it's one that I've recommended to quite a few people now. And again, just something completely different, and that's not in the Antarctic and not in the Himalayas, but still cold and makes you reach for a blanket. But those are my 6 books, from the shelves that are linked by snow and ice and fret and frill, and I hope there's something there that really intrigues you. And if you've read anything that you think would interest me off the back of those recommendations, let me know. Or if you've read any of those books and you have thoughts on them, let me know. It'll be really great. So meet me in the comments afterwards. And if you're new to the channel, do subscribe to come along for the ride. But it's been really lovely talking to you about these books, and I hope that you have an amazing week. So I'll speak to you again soon. Take care. Bye.